I'm just so proud to be from Detroit. I'm very thankful for Jen and Kyoru and that meditation on Detroit and techno. So now I'll just transition into introducing the rest of the panelists for this talk. Michèle Stephenson is a filmmaker, artist, and author who pulls from her Haitian and Panamanian roots to think radically about storytelling and disrupt the imaginary in nonfiction spaces. She tells emotionally driven personal stories of resistance and identity that are created by, for, and about communities of color and the Black diaspora. Her stories intentionally reimagine and provoke thought about how we engage with and dismantle the internalized impact of systems of oppression. Stephenson draws on fiction, immersive, and hybrid forms of storytelling to build her worlds and narratives. Her feature documentary, American Promise, was nominated for 3 Emmys and won the jury prize at Sundance. Her more recent feature documentary, Stateless, was nominated for a Canadian Academy Award for Best Feature Documentary. Stephenson also collaborated as co-director on Magical Realist virtual reality trilogy series on racial terror. Racial Terror, The Changing Same, which was recently nominated for an Emmy in the Outstanding Interactive Media Innovative category, and premiered at Sundance Film Festival. It also won the Grand Jury Prize for Best Immersive Narrative at narrative at the 2021 Tribeca Film Festival. Sorry about that. Along with her writing partners, Joe Brewster and Hilary Beard, Stephenson won an NAACP Image Award for Excellence in a literary work for their book, Promises Kept. She is a member of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Science, a Guggenheim Artist Fellow, and a Creative Capital Artist. Please welcome Michèle Stephenson to the stage. Final panelist is Darol, who was born in 1984. He's an artist and filmmaker from and based in Los Angeles. Kay's artistic practice disrupts conventional narrative structures of storytelling through its dynamic treatment of sound and image. His collaborative, research-based approach to art and filmmaking grounds itself in the precarious yet generative power of the Black experience in America. Kay has collaborated with visionary filmmakers such as Khalil Joseph and A.J. Rojas, and his own film work has screened at festivals and institutions worldwide, including Black Star Film Festival, Camden International Film Festival, Locarno Film Festival, MoCA Los Angeles, Sundance Film Festival. He was awarded the Pardino d'Oro, I'm sure I chopped that up, for Best International Short Film in 2020 at the Locarno Film Festival for his film, I Ran From It and Was Still In It. And in 2021, I Ran From It earned special jury recognition for poetry at the 2021 South by Southwest Film Festival. Kay is currently in pre-production for his next short film project, Keeping Time, which will premiere at CAAM, and developing his feature directorial debut, Without a Song. So, without further ado, welcome Darol. Hello, these lights are bright, right? Thank you for being here with us today and for screening your films for our girls, and I ran from it and was still in it. I want to begin by discussing the archival work that went into your respective films. It functions like a citation practice in many ways from my perspective. Video archival specifically orients us back to history and discourse, especially in your respective works. So can you talk about your process for finding existing moving image archives for your films and how you go about discerning which ones to choose?
Well, first, thank you, and thank everyone. Yeah, I appreciate you all being here, and yeah, just kind of moving with the pieces for us, with this. For me, the archival practice kind of happened organically, right? So a lot of my film contains like personal archival material that I collected prior to even the idea and conception of the film actually manifesting. It was something that was demanded based on the situation. Around the film, it was my children left. My children, I was married, and my children abruptly moved across the country. And so my daughter came to me one day and was like, let's make a film. And it's on our phone, so we're just like, the last month was just us capturing all that stuff. And I had it, and it just was like in my back pocket, and I didn't know what I would do with it. And I did like a little exercise. I was working on a project, and I did an exercise at the beginning of the film, the dance sequence with the James Baldwin riff on it. It was just a thing to play around with. And then once we locked in, there's an Abby Lincoln, Ivan Dixon moment when Abby Lincoln is like, she says something to the extent of like she wants to have a child, let's have a baby. And Ivan Dixon in that moment was just so much doubt, insecurity, hesitance in him that he embodied. For me, it was like, oh wait, something's happening. So the theme thematically started crystallizing. And I went back to my archive and literally made the film maybe in 4 days. I just sat and just like pushed it out. So the choice, it's intentional, but also for me it was kind of being able to submit to the archive and kind of be an acute listener to the material. Because I didn't want to be in the film. I'm like in it a little bit. I'm like, it's very, my children are in it. It's like, what you doing? It's like screaming all over. But I feel like there was like an idea, there was an emotion, there was something that needed to be manifested and actualized. And so part of it was, I think I'm naturally just like curious about troubling the archive, and unsettling it. A lot of the stuff in the archive is like guarded and kind of institutionally sanctioned. And so for me it was, is there a way to dig into the personal archive and get so close that it becomes like general or universal? And so those choices were just made unconsciously. And then once momentum started, just like depth was important for me.
Yeah, I think this idea of what you mentioned, emotion being sort of part of what's leads me into archive. For me, actually, my background is more in observational and verite filmmaking, including personal kind of turning the camera on ourselves and my family. Did that for about 13 years with the documentary American Promise. And over the years, I guess, in terms of trying to push the form and be creative and work with different materials, sort of led me into looking at archival. This particular piece, which is sort of interesting if you look at in terms of the practice, it was both the pandemic, George Floyd, and that sort of led me into re-examining a previous piece that I had done as a collaborative process with the New York Times Op Docs. Was called Conversations on Race, and it was a series that was led out of Ferguson. And so there was a short piece that was done, basically interviewed a lot of my friends and colleagues, women, looking at that particular perspective at that particular time. And then the pandemic hit, but then also George Floyd happened, and we were commissioned to sort of relook at the material. Or actually, we talked about doing some sort of remix of the material that had existed 5 years prior and see what patterns could emerge. So the material that I had actually shot in the interviews became their own archive. And so with that 5 year sort of evolution, both artistically but also personally and societally, diagonally, re-looking at the dialogue and the conversations that were happening, other patterns emerged. And I think that's what's really sort of, for me, quite transformative, looking at archival from this sort of present day lens and thinking about what does it teach me, but also how can I engage with it in a way that it might even say something new, or there's something different that comes out of it. And so there were conversations that were on the cutting room floor, back in 2015, that sort of became sort of this North Star for this piece. So that's what I found really interesting, and I'm actually doing more and more work sort of engaging with archival in that way.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think it's important to note the very form and how it changed from that 2015 work that you offered up and this work that we saw here today. The previous work was primarily just Black women in confessional type situations in black and white, just speaking directly about these various anecdotes, right? And there was very little sort of narration or like general objective voice sort of holding our hand through the 6-minute doc, right? Which I appreciated, just Black women talking about their experiences. I want to maybe hear you talk a little bit more about that dialectic that happened between the previous work and this current one. And I guess like the new things that emerged in the retrospect that you learned throughout that process.
I think the new things that emerged were somewhat, in some way, personal. I was looking a lot at the material as a mother. And I realized that almost all of the conversations that we had, at some point there was a conversation about either daughters talking about their mothers or mothers talking about their daughters. That didn't quite make that first piece, because I think we were trying to speak to something, I wouldn't say less personal, but it wasn't there. And so this was really an opportunity for me also as a parent, as a mother, to sort of delve in that conversation with the material, not with them necessarily directly, but with the material and with what they had to say that still was relevant. And then also, the violence that was happening against Black women at the time was sort of the atmosphere around which the material was being worked on in 2020. And so, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but
no,
yeah.
It does,
yeah.
It does. And I think it's evergreen that we're still in that atmosphere, especially with regard to Black trans women. So yeah, I think it's oddly and unfortunately relevant in many ways. I'm glad that you brought up the dynamic between mother and daughter being more pronounced in the recent iteration of the film. I think in both of your films, or it's a fact, in both of your films, there's these generational dynamics. You with your children, Darol, and Michèle, just broadly with your daughter, but also with other mothers and daughters. So I just want to hear you maybe talk about how significant it is for you to represent multiple generations in your film work, and if that showed up in other projects, or if that's something that you're just sort of considering throughout multiple projects over time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's, for me, I didn't understand that was part of the project until the thing was made, right? But it's definitely kind of this thing where I wanted to push it against the autobiographical model, right? But also in that pushing against, acknowledge, one, yes, generally my relationship with my children, that's like the launching pad, that's the departure point. But from that, I was able to kind of examine and interrogate like my relationship with my father, and then my father's relationship, with his mother and father, which might not be present explicitly in the film, but those are the ideas, right, around kind of intergenerational like transmission, right, where not much information is known personally by me of everyone on my father's side. I don't know that. So you see like archival photographs that were kind of incorporated and kind of brought into the piece. Literally, it's like from my father's archive, and he's never spoken about, he had like 2 brothers, he never said a word about his brothers to me, half brothers. He never really spoke about his mother. And I found this box of photographs, and it's like, this is like technically like family. These are my kin, these are my people, right? But I don't know them. You know, I know there's my grandfather there, or it could be, it kind of looks like him. So there's this like ambiguity around like family, you know? And so I was already thinking about family, already thinking about kind of the love that endures, you know, against and in dispersion, right? And kind of separation. And like, what is love? Like at that moment, I was just like going through some stuff with my children. Like, you know, love is also, like if you're into like Buddhist philosophies, like love is like, be present. It's like, how do I reconcile deeply loving my children and also not being physically present? How do I wrestle with that shit? You know what I mean? So that's, I mean, it's still kind of what it is, because you know, they're physically in Philadelphia, but so that led me to think about my father and, you know, his father, and just like the ambiguity between my relationship. And these intergenerational conversations, they're happening even in the present. So for me, it was just finding a way creatively to I'm not even doing anything, and you know, like that's not going on already. Like the past, the present, and future are already interwoven together. So it's really just accentuating like that happen. Like I feel that shit. Like I know the past is speaking now, the future is already informed by, you know, all this stuff is intermingled. And so the work was an experiment to try to accentuate, to try to like flesh that out, to try to just feel, just to like, give myself over to that feeling and just like see what manifests.
Yeah, I think, as I was thinking as you were talking about, I think all my films actually seem to have some kind of intergenerational thing. But I think there's an unconscious, right? There's an unconscious that draws us to however we, you know, art is very personal. Even if it's about someone else or it's about the subject matter that we think is always very personal. And so there's also, I think, in the practice, in this process of this intergenerational aspect, whether it's our ancestors or our children, there's this search for healing. Certainly for me, I feel that, whether it's my previous work and what I'm working on now, the search for my own personal healing that happens through also, you know, just not just being with the material, but connecting with others, you know. So this idea of community and not being isolated, right? So there's the collective history, there's the personal, then there's the actual sort of engagement with each other. Certainly with the women who were in the short, seeing my story and their story, seeing their dilemma with their children, or with their mothers, and seeing that reflected and understanding that I'm going through that process as well. And there's something we can teach each other on a horizontal level as mothers, but also, you know, that. And also, I think the other part, there were a couple of remarks around breaking the chain of intergenerational trauma as well. That I think only through the intergenerational conversations can we sort of like bring that up, bring that to the front, to the conscious, that we can try not to repeat, you know, what we sort of have suffered from. So it's part of that journey for me anyway, personally.
Thank you for that. You know, there's so many like gripping points in your film, Darol, that could be really, really emotional, but it begins with the Styles P interview that he did with his wife a couple of years ago. And taken out of context, you know, just that clip, like it's still very powerful, but like if you ever watch that interview, you know the context, and they're talking about the loss of their daughter, who, you know, passed away due to suicide. And so, you know, I think just like that moment, and then the father talking about going to school with his daughter, and just a series of sort of roller coasters between like love and grief and loss, right? And Michèle, yours approaches it from a different lens, but just thinking about like the innocence lost with the young girl when she doesn't have much confidence around her, when she's around her peers in these primarily white spaces, right? There's a sort of grief that happens there. And I just wanted to sort of address like the thread of grief that has run through all of these films, right? I want to talk to you all and maybe hear you speak about how maybe difficult or cathartic it is to render grief in your respective projects, and how you engage with grief through filmmaking process. That was a pretty loaded question, but if you can go there with me, would appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for the question too. I think that's the first time someone's picked up on that and asked about the Styles P stuff, so I appreciate that. Yeah, it was another exercise, right? To sustain, how long can we, like, editorially, like, sustain an idea was part of the exercise. And what it contained was, one, this pushback against, like, the autobiographical kind of model that's very prevalent, not just in film, but in, like, Black literary traditions, right? Where, you know, Black stories often are like, you know, historical dramas or something that's like based on like this idea of the real. So I wanted to push back against kind of myself, and it's not a film about, oh, look at me and my family. It's not about that. It was trying to see if, you know, I could make a specific general, you know, in that way, this hyper local, like, instead of kind of being very, you know, like a macro kind of perspective, or micro perspective. So the stuff about grief is central because it's really going away from my personal ideas of grief and loss and kind of broadening it, right? Inviting it to consider the multiplicity of grief and loss. And so part of that was really just trying to find entry points to move away from myself, which is also like a deepening of the personal story that kind of reaches, you know, beyond and past the limits of what folks might consider this kind of like very personal, very like biographical piece. It was really trying to blow that open and kind of make it more than just merely kind of my thing.
First, I do want to acknowledge my co-director on For Our Girls, Imani Dennison, who was supposed to come but couldn't make it. I think she comes to mind also, or they come to mind also for me in the process of community and collaboration when it comes to working with material that where you know, grief is sort of central, or processing it. I think for me, the dialogue around it is really essential. Most of my work is very much in collaboration, either with co-directors or producers who are very involved also creatively. And so the conversations and the dialogue that happen creatively in the process, I think, help in processing the grief in that creative practice. And so in this particular case, it was definitely sort of a communal effort with our editor as well, Stephenson, and the work that we did in sort of exploring those moments and then taking the time to have the conversations around those moments, laughing as well in the process, and figuring out a way to honor the grief as well, visually. So I think sort of community both in the practice and later in the discussions as well is sort of part of how we process it.
I wanted to add, hello. Thank you, we're back. Just real quick, I just want to say, in addition to, on the line of the grief line, for me the film was, I've wrestled with the idea of like Black creativity, you know, being indebted to grief and suffering and trauma. Like, what's the role between the relation between the two, right? I wanted to push back and get away from, is Black creativity indebted to grief? Like, what is Black creativity without stories of trauma, suffering, loss, so on and so forth? So part of this was wanting to push against that, but this sorry about that, with Baldwin's idea of like total action, and eventually just kind of leaned into it. So I haven't resolved that question, but I did want to just say it and put it in the air, because it's something that I still wrestle with, right, in terms of, you know, profound joy is there, love is there, but also like what is, you know, creativity, specifically like Black creative and cultural production, you know, in relationship to like grief, loss, and suffering, you know.
I just want to add something else to that, which is sort of what's at tension too, is silence. For me, there was also a lot of family silence, and to sort of avoid confronting grief or the pain that that causes. But of course, that comes out in different ways. So that's another push towards an artistic practice, I think, to kind of deal with the silence that also exists. So it's kind of this, you know, there are these polar opposites. There's the, you know, the overexposure of trauma from a certain lens, but then the opposite is that silence that's sort of killing us as well. Yeah, he wants to. Oh.
Thank you. I just have one more question for you all. Maybe if you're working on something currently, Darol, you mentioned Keep in Time. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about that. Michèle, if you're working on something, you're such a decorated director and filmmaker, so would love to hear what you're working on.
Yeah, Keep in Time, that's like my thing right now. Like, we're actually locking picture on Monday, Tuesday. I'm super stoked about it. So, yeah. It's a project that's I've had my heart for a few years. So yeah, Keep in Time is essentially a film about art making and collaboration. And I'm fortunate to be making it in partnership and community with the Pan-African People's Orchestra. And I'm really stoked to bring that to y'all and just like share that with y'all. And yeah, it should be coming soon. I know it's gonna do festival circuit and museum, CAAM, you know, so I'm really happy about that and looking forward to bringing that into the world. Woo.
I am in sort of the final month of post-production on a feature, sort of hybrid documentary in partnership, co-directing with my partner Joe Brewster. We've been working on this for about 5 years. No, actually 7 years from beginning to now, in collaboration with Nikki Giovanni. And it's, I think I'd like to call it more of a time travel dreamscape in her mind through her voice, titled Going to Mars. It's based on one of her poems, We're Quilting the Black Eyed Pea, We're Going to Mars. And so, very excited about it. We delve into a lot of archival there too, but there's, she's been gracious enough to allow us to also film with her, so there's some observational moments as well that are sort of these launching pads to go back in time and really sort of relish her poetry and prophetic sort of person. So excited about that.
So we will open it up briefly for Q&A from the audience. Do we have someone to walk around with this mic or no? Somebody able? Excuse me?
You want me to run the mic?
Sure, if you're willing. Anyone have questions for the panelists? Maybe it'll be very brief. We can end there. All right, thank you all.
Oh, wait, I probably can just shout. I just was struck by this last question to find out Nikki Giovanni and Horace Tapscott as like the center of your work at this moment. Is a really profound thing. I'd like to hear you say something about that. That's just so exciting to me.
see it. What I will say is, it's sort of in line with what Darol's been talking about, that it is not a biopic. It's really a celebration. There are some elements that are definitely of outer space in dealing with trauma, but in a way that is that sort of centers resistance and creativity, and we're hoping Nikki will be able to travel with us with the film. So yeah, we're very excited about it. We're definitely playing with the form in this case. It's all in her voice. There are no interviews. It's all either her archival performances, her poetry reading, along with some visual poetry that we put together to complement. We visit different eras with her as she sort of looks back and thinks about the legacy that she's leaving behind.
Yeah, Horace Tapscott, Los Angeles, like Black LA music. I mean, so I'm from LA, and I didn't know about Horace Tapscott until I was like an adult, right? And I felt some type of way. I still feel some type of way about that. You know what I mean? And this is with like a lot of, I was raised in Compton, South Central, Watts. I didn't even know about the centrality and the importance of Watts to the Black LA cultural, artistic landscape until I was in my mid-20s. And I lived right down the street from the Watts Towers. So I was like, okay, and I went to Jefferson High School too, which then I found out Horace went to Jefferson High School, and Dr. Samuel Brown went to Jeff. And it was like understanding the importance of these sites, right? And the people, and knowing that, Don Cherry, went from Fremont to Jeff to kind of learn, and Mingus and Alma Hightower, and it's like, yo, I didn't know any of this walking in these halls. I didn't know any of this in Watts, and for me, just wanting to kind of, I got very obsessive about it and just kind of dove really, really deep and took it personal, you know what I mean? And so with Horace, if you listen to Horace, it's like, how could you not, right? Because he just bestows this type of, like, this is your music. And he's like, I internalize that. Like, I walk around like I'm a member of the art, and but I believe that in talking, just knowing the history, also knowing the history of, or learning the history of avant-garde jazz, and how LA is so central to that. Black LA is Black LA. Like, and when you talk about jazz, it's like, we have an idea. Like, you're probably thinking of like some, Kenny G, or like whatever image in your mind, a sound in your mind when I say jazz, and even as a word, what you think about, right? But just understanding like LA, and then also understanding like when you think of avant-garde jazz or free jazz, oftentimes people are like, oh, New York, yeah, no, that's LA, that's our shit. Horace Tapscott, that's even before that, that's, Ornette Coleman, but who was in Ornette Coleman's band, So, and all those band members were, from LA. I'm thinking about the world stage, but I could just keep going. I'm like fighting myself to not just like go down and get excited. It's like,
if I can just say a few things, just by virtue of working closely with you and seeing a rough cut of the film, I think there's many sort of qualities that it offers, but I think for me as a curator and someone who's just interested in how creative projects come into public sphere, and all the work that goes into that's invisibilized, I think you make it very clear and evidence all of the logistics and the economies and like overextensions that happen between community members just to accommodate this overarching goal to practice together, to be creative together, to sit in the garage together and waste time together, to get to the actual artwork, and the final product, which is like the tip of the iceberg, right?
No, thank you for that. Like, that's the thing, right? And this is like larger in relationship to like, and this is me going on a tangent, but like jazz in the space of cinema and its representation in film. Oftentimes it's with jazz is seen as like, its representation is very voyeuristic and it's at the moment of creative explosion. It's the musician playing, right? And if you listen to the musician and turn over those vinyls, so much of the music, and they tell you, is about, they're named after like loved ones, they're named after places, and it's really about relationships between musicians, relationships between musicians and their environment, and then the relationship between musicians and their spiritual ancestors, right? And so it's like, oh, that's the shit we should be making a film about. Like, not the music, so it's us trying to like push against this music by way of detour, right? Like, you know, the relationships are the thing that make the music possible, so let's make a film about the relationships. If we're really interested in that creative explosion, the fuel and source of that creative explosion is the relationship, and it's not always easy too. And it's like difficult, and it's like the elders are like, I'm an elder, like, you know, in the art, it's currently led by Michèle Sessions, a 26-year-old drummer who grew up in the art. His father, Michael Sessions, was the founder after Horace passed, not the founder, but the musical director and the band leader after Horace passed. And Michèle's been in the band since he was like 9 years old. You know, but these people have known him, they're his family, they've known him all his life, and so it's like him kind of just like, I'm taking this on. Like, yeah, they assigned him the role of the band leader, but he's like, yeah, okay, we're doing this, but then also like still discovering who he is as an artist. And for me, it's about the band, but it's also something that we all do, right? Like, we all have to interrogate like our own inheritance. Like, what are the inheritance is like what we claim. Like, we're going to claim certain things from our past, and we're going to leave certain things in our past behind us. So the film is kind of about, you know, what are the things that we claim, what are the things that we take on, what gets left behind, and also, you know, it is in the coming together that, you know, is really important. It's, you know, when we come together to figure it out and figure out this plan to move forward, the important thing isn't the plan that we arrive at, but it's actually the act of coming together to figure it out. That's the important thing. Sorry about that.
Does that answer your question?
Skills here, so happy.
Anyone else?
My question is also kind of tied to Darol and Michelle's kind of process in terms of fragmenting images and sound and sound. And how you choose to fragment image and the use of a lot of echoing and a lot of these like dampened, muted sounds. I'm really interested in also how this ties into Jen's piece about the equilibrium and this idea of the ear kind of being the place for stabilization and location. And I'm just interested in your process in terms of brief and fragmentation and dislocation and how that all comes in.
I'm going to be super brief. Sound is extremely important to me because it's overlooked oftentimes. And there's like an image hierarchy. So for me, sound is connected to the unconscious. We hear before we see, right? And so I use sound in tapping into the unconscious. And visually, I'm always interested in like disrupting expectations. You know, cinema's so young as an art form, where we're so locked into this idea that we know what it is. We don't, and that's great. You know what I mean? Like, we could still explore, and there's so many possibilities. And I think sound, if we pay more attention to sound, I think, you know, that unlocks so much potential for discovery.
Yeah, I completely agree. Sound is critical to the process. I think for me, there's also, it's the element of emotion, and sometimes I can't it's not something I can, it's just there, right? So it's first what hits me emotionally and then building from there. Whether it's sonoric, whether it's visual or dialogue or what's being said, and letting that be the driver, you know, in terms of what's built around it.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming out, and thank you all.